On this National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, it's important for all of us to reflect on the uncomfortable truths of Canada's past. I'm grateful to Dr. Darren Thomas and the Office of Indigenous Initiatives for creating this virtual session that honors the lives lost and the families impacted by the residential school system. I urge everyone on this day to hold space for reflection and to learn more about our country's colonial past. Education and awareness is just the beginning of our journey toward reconciliation. Beyond September 30th, I encourage you to read and reflect on the 94 calls to action and consider how you can use your skills and strengths to work on one or more actions. Thank you for taking the time to increase your awareness and understanding on this day.
Bojo Gichimanado, Anjabinisi Kwe Indigenous Cause, Makwa and Dodem, Nisamadewian, Bawating and Donjaba, Anishinaabe Kwe and Dow. Miigwech for this opportunity to come together. Help us strive for balance and harmony in our everyday. Reach to live in a good way. Be good human beings. Be good for each other. Good for our first mother. For all of creation. Help us fan the flame of respect. Bring kind, honest sharing, its strength and truth to our meeting this evening. For there is great urgency to engage and re-engage truth and reconciliation. There is much challenge and hard work in front of us in the work of lifting up the truth, in the work of lifting up reconciliation. Help us continue this work. Help us do this work in the way that we engage our everyday life. Miigwech Gajeminido, Nakanagana.
Good day. My name is Darren Thomas. I'm the Associate Vice President of Indigenous Initiatives here at Wilfrid Laurier University. This September 30th has been named National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. This day is about reconciling and reconsidering Canada's history and the role and harm it has caused on Indigenous families. For a lot of Canadians today, they don't spend the time to think about this country's history and the harmful legacy. This day isn't about pointing fingers and causing hurtful feelings towards anybody, but it's the realization and understanding that this country emerged from pre-existing land and civilizations that had existed here for thousands of years. Although we're very proud and love Canada today, in its infancy, a lot of the leaders created policies of harm, of genocide. And this is a legacy that's still felt today. And this is a very critical day for us in this country to look at and consider this history and to decide what is our future. Where do we want to go as a nation, now called Canada? We have pre-existing nations that were joined by many emerging societies and newcomers today that still want to enjoy a peaceful coexistence on this land. This coexistence emerged, we now call the One Dish, One Spoon Treaty. This was about a shared living on this land, and it was also constructed into Two-Row Wampum Belt Treaty. These agreements were about coexisting in peace and friendship. These agreements were about coexisting in peace and friendship and living side by side. We still desire to have those kind of relations as we move forward in Canada. but we all have to learn from this country's history in order to do so. As a collective society, we all have a role, duty, and responsibility to bring reconciliation into being. This day should be about learning from this country's history and beginning to consider your role in its future. Thank you. Well, welcome. And we have a very special guest visiting us here in our virtual world at Laurier today on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. We actually are going to be visiting with Sherlene Bomberry. I've known Sherlene for a number of years. Sherlene is a community member at Six Nations. And she's done a lot of work in her life and within the community, supporting health and healing, and has really helped many families along their journey, along their path to healing. And Sherlene is certainly someone that I honor greatly and for all of these efforts that she's done. And on top of all that, Sherlene carries a great burden, but she holds it well and strong. And she's a former student at the Mohawk Institute that was located in the city of Brantford. And when often we look at former students and we refer to them as survivors, because of the legacy of harm they've experienced. But what I often refer to when I'm talking about Sherlene is she's a thriver. She's worked really hard on her well-being, and she's really worked hard to endure that history and process and really use her time on this earth to heal and help others heal. So I really want to honor you with those words, Sherlene, and I'm proud to call you my friend, and that we can do this work together, and so grateful you've agreed to visit with us today. So thank you very much and welcome.
Yeah, Scano, Swogego, Ewahawi Nijaso, Hota Yoni, Nebuka Shelter, Gayakuno New York. My first name is and she carries flowers. It's in I'm a wolf from the Wolf Clan in the Kiegan Nation. Here on Six Nations of the Grand. And I start telling my sharing about my experience at the residential school about 21 years ago. I was there in 1966 and in 1970, June 1970 when it closed. And but I just start sharing. I took off this coat of shame and guilt that I've been carrying, wearing for all these years since I left there when I was 13. And I finally took it off, and I just said, you know what? I was there. I was very shameful that I was taken away from my mom. I was ashamed to say that I had to go someplace else, right? And then I cleared the guilt about going to school and everything like that. And I thought maybe because I had to, I was a caretaker at home, so at my young age, when my mom worked and that, so I just thought that if I should have went to school, I blamed myself. I carried that shame and guilt for that, and I went there in 1966. I got my first name when I was in Longhouse because my birthday's in December. And we had midwinter ceremonies in January, so I got my first name then. And then because my mom had to register me, I had to have an English name, so that's how I got Sherlene. So yeah. But that's what I go back to that now. And I'm going like a circle, the circle of life, right? because that's where I was raised. I was being raised in the longhouse ceremonies that on Six Nations. So on my dad's side of the family, they were longhouse. So, but when my mom and dad split up when I was 5, we came up this end of the reserve, and there was only one longhouse, but we didn't go there, and we didn't even know about this other longhouse, and then so I never went there, and I never went back again until I went back on my own, probably about 20 years ago, and yeah, so I've gone through a lot, it's probably separations. I was just thinking the other day too about how much we're separated, and then how much what the schools did, what their purpose was, right? And I'm so proud of myself that I went back and to learn my language, and I could say who I am, who I truly am, in my language, in my clan, in my nation. And I do basic Kegel language too, which I speak to with my grandchildren, so. And one of my girls have gone back to school too for her bachelor's in language, Kegel language. So I'm very proud of her that she's taken this education and everything for that, and to pick up and to share with her little ones that she has. Her other oldest one was in Gowaneo. She was in Gowaneo from JKSK. and she and then she went to grade 1, and she goes, Grandma, I'm gonna go to school and learn English. so she started out learning Kegel, so I'm glad that it's still instilled in her, right? So she speaks to her brother in the language too, her little 2.5-year-old. But yeah, I've come a long way myself, like Darren said, that I've done a lot of work on myself, because I don't want to be carrying this around, and I don't want I I seen and I by my feeling by myself that how hard it is to carry, to walk this journey without knowing who you are and everything like that. So yeah, I had to go step back and take these steps and everything to care about who I am and everything, find out who I am, because it wasn't in the history books or anything like that when I was going to school. So so yeah, it was quite the journey. But in 1966, first 65, the separation began with my brothers and sisters. I come from a family of 8, and I'm the second oldest. But my oldest brother wasn't raised with us, and he was given away, I guess, to another family to raise him. And I didn't know that until my brother was 16 when he come and told us. So my mom never said nothing about it. And then, my mom had to go to the hospital just so she wouldn't have a miscarriage or anything with my sister when she was pregnant, who was born January 1966. So I went to foster home on a reserve. Me and my sister went to a foster home, and it was a church, like a church one. And the pastor and his wife there, they had a whole family too. I think there was about 5 or 6 in that family, and they had another one who was a Crown Ward. They had him too. So my sister and I went there, and she was only 4, or no, she just turned 5. She turned 5 then, and then and I was 9. I was 9 years old. I'm turning to 10 that December. But my 3 brothers went to another foster home not too far over from where I live now in Tunline. And when we got reunited to come back home, my baby brother didn't come home. He became Crown Ward then, because they said that he was sickly, and we lived in a log house, a log house. It's back then, we used to watch Little House on the Prairie and everything like that, and we didn't dress like Mary Ingalls or anything like that. Yeah, but I mean, the log house was cold, like wood stove, coal oil lamp, and everything. We never had electricity, so TV was out of the question for me. I thought, what the heck is that? You know, like I got to watch TV. I got to watch TV when I went into the residential school in September 1966. Four of us were taken in by the Children's Aid, and Mr. Moore, says to my mom that she could probably better look after my one sister that was just born in January if we were out of her hands for a while. So we were only supposed to go there for 10 months to the residential school in Brantford. So he took us there, and my mom and my sister were left at home. And yeah, that's where I got my first hit, you know, and had to get, you know, like, because I was feeling like had to put my hands out and everything like that. And when I got taken to the bathroom, like a bunch of us, and because the house the staff said, she said, we didn't have a good day today. And I was missing my mom and my sister because we're 20 minutes away, but still we don't get to see her, right? And I was missing her, so I put my hand up, and so afterwards I thought she was going to ask, like, what, like, sit down and listen to me why I'm sad, you know. But she did. She just said, go to the bathroom. Went to the bathroom there. I said, oh, he's lying up there. So he's lying up, and she took a ruler and just hit us on the hands one by one, like, you know, just kept on going. I thought, what is this? You know, like, I'm 10 years old. I'm going to be 11 in December, you know. What's going on? I never been hit before, you know, and I did cry because it hurt. It hurt, but I didn't understand. So from that point on, I learned to listen. Everything that I had to do there, I had to do. I did it because there was no way I was ever going to get hit again like that. And especially from there, and with a ruler. The strap was downstairs in the office, but she hit us with a ruler. And I'm 10 years old. My sister's 5, and I'm on top bunk and she's on bottom bunk. And I used to hear the little girls cry at nighttime because they come from far away. You know, the Crees, they would come, and the Jubilees would come from at the end of August. And they never went back home until the end of June. So for 10 months, they didn't see their parents at all. And I kind of like minimized myself. Like, that wasn't, I see my mom maybe about once a month. She would come and pick us up. And I come home for Christmas, and I come home for March break and Easter. But I don't really remember those times. Because at home too, there was domestic violence going on. And it was scary. It was so scary living in that. And I had to walk to school for a long ways. I missed that bus that came there. So a mile and a half walking. Like, you're 10 years old, you're walking to school like that, you know. And my sister was 5, so she didn't go to school. And she didn't go to school either in residential school. She was 5, but she was 6 in October, so she had to go to the French class, and there was a French teacher there, and I didn't really know why there was a French teacher until I start learning about John McDonald and John A. McDonald and Duncan Campbell Scott, what they had to say, and about taking our language away and everything, because the Crees, when they came from West Waunapie, Darren met them, and they're trilingual, you know. So in order for them not to speak their Cree, there was a French teacher there. She spoke French and English, and that's where my sister had to go, and the other ones that were younger underage for grade 1 had to go there too. So it was the first year there was like I got hit, and I learned to keep my feelings to myself then. Don't talk to anybody, don't trust anybody with my feelings, and you know, like, and not feel. So that was all repressed down in me. And I was telling Darren that with the all these years, like, I've been talking about it. Oh, I heard the girls crying at nighttime, and you got about 35, 40 girls, the young girls, so 10 and under, in a dormitory and in bunk beds, and that's still bunk beds, and you can't sleep with each other. you know, because the house mother's right there down the hallway was her bedroom. And so you just hear this crying all by herself. Like, and we didn't have teddy bears or toys or anything like that. All we had was just a blanket and a pillow to, you know, to try to get some comfort from, you know. And I could hear my little sister crying on the bottom bunk. If I, there's not, I was scared because I had already been hit, you know, so I wasn't going to go comfort her. And, and that really affected me because to this day, I really don't go and comfort my family. You know what I mean? When they're hurting, I just, I just let them cry, whatever they have to do. And that really affected me because it stopped me from doing that, comforted. Well, I do little children and that because, I have a better understanding now. But with the adults, I just couldn't, I didn't know what to say, back then. And so with that crying and everything like that, and the girls crying, with the June 215, I went back there, I went back to the residential school in grade 7 and grade 8, and it closed in June 1970. So me and my sister went back there. Still didn't want to be at home because of my mom's partner, like domestic violence and that. And I got slapped. I got slapped by him once. I got sexually abused by him. And so I wanted to be out of there. So my sister and I went back to the residential school, grade 7 and grade 8 for me. And then it closed. But after that, I had my first child. I had three kids, and I still have 3 kids. Like, they're older, they're 42, 43, and 44. And Saturday, my oldest will be 45. And I have 13 grandchildren, and I have one great grandson. So I'm so lucky, so gifted. I have a set of older grandchildren, and then I have a set of younger grandchildren that are closer to me on the reserve here now. When that 215 came, when that recovery of the 215 came, it just hit my body. It hit my body really hard because that's when my body just, I cried. I sat there and I cried so loud, and I gave my cry sound because when I was at the residential school, I didn't cry loud because I didn't, it was just to myself and everything, and I had to push it down. And then I was scared to cry because I thought I'd never quit when I started counseling. It was like, I don't want to cry, I don't want to cry. I don't just, it was. And then afterwards, but with that 215, it hit me in June, and I cried. I got angry. All weekend, I was just processing. I was just letting go, releasing things. Right? It was finally coming out. It was finally coming out. And then I said, and then I realized, I said, I used to tell people about hearing a girl's cry at nighttime, but I was emotionally numb. Those were just words coming out of my mouth and everything. I was emotionally numb. And so yeah, so at that weekend though, I had a really big release and everything. And I'm glad, like that, because your body holds on to trauma forever, for a long time and it'll keep coming up, like everybody has trauma, but it'll keep coming up. And because, where I work, we have to do psychodramatic body work, and there's points in our body where we hold our anger, where we hold our sadness, and our fear and everything like that. So there's points in our body where we hold these emotions and energy. So yeah, I have a lot of modalities like Reiki and reflexology and everything. And I use the great outdoors as my best medicine, to release and everything. Mother Earth, I go out there and I just, I do earthing, like at my feet on the sand or in the dirt or on the grass, just to let her take that because she will, because with so much sadness and everything that's going on, she's gonna get cleansed. You know, the rain is coming again, and she's gonna get cleansed. So just give it to her. You know, give it to her. You don't have to carry it. Yeah. But through the years, like I kept silent about it. Nothing was ever talked about residential school, and I didn't share it either. You know, because like I said, I had that code of shame and guilt on when I started holistic counseling. Nobody understood when I started counseling, and I ended up my marriage and everything like that. But they didn't even know what residential school was. And whoa, well, how are you gonna help me then if you don't know what it is, right? So yeah, so I just had to leave her, you know, because she didn't understand. Well, you don't understand where I'm coming from. But I
I,
had a lot of, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's been some of the biggest challenges for many Canadians, um, is they haven't heard any of this story, and when the announcements of the mass graves and our graves start coming up, I think it was a shock for everyone, for Indigenous families and for former students and survivors. Um, but for Canadians as well, I think that um, just it made everything so real for everyone.
Mhm.
And I know for Indigenous families and communities, we've been living that trauma, and you're describing it so well, the pain that we've had to endure. Um, but I think, you know, in a lot of the work that I've done and the research and as a scholar and as a community worker as well. It's helping connect those dots from that history and legacy of colonialism and the harms that occurred through many of those laws and policies. That that's why we're seeing such continual hardship. And I think for many Canadians, it was the first time they themselves start connecting some of the dots. So when we start looking at, now we're in this place on this day of truth and reconciliation, where we're asking everyone to kind of reflect on this history. What are, you know, in your mind, what is the most important things that you would like um, people to learn from this history and take away from this moment in time?
Well, just listening to survivors and listening to and help and understanding, gain an understanding, you know, to because I had to gain an understanding to why my mom raised us the way she did, you know. And when I found out that, you know, my grandma was there in 1917 for 2 years, so I see how the patterns and how the cycles continued. And if you don't break it, you know, you're like I have 3 generations already. You know, I've already got 3 generations, and I passed this down, you know, until I started my healing journey 21 years ago. I just want people to know it's gonna take time. Some people don't even want to talk about it, you know. They don't want to talk about it because it's too shameful. It's too, you know, what happened to them. This wasn't their fault, but they're taking, you know, like they take the blame for that. And I myself am not taking no blame anymore, you know, for what happened. And when I look back on those two passages of McDonald and Duncan Campbell Scott, read that over and over again. You know, read it over and over and let it sink in and say, this is what Canada did to our people, you know? Because when I didn't read it until I read it, I was so angry, so angry at them. And I kept reading it, you know, like, what? You know, this, I'm going to turn this around for myself, you know? And so, like, it can be turned around. Anything can be turned around if you want it, because there's always solutions to it. But just being aware, like, my mom was raised off reserves, so she never got taken in, you know. So, but when she came back here, here's, you know, me 10 years old getting taken in and everything like that. Tend to, then my two brothers in there, and then, you know, like, I have My two youngest ones are still numbing. They're still numbing their, from what happened to them. They're carrying that shame, they're carrying that guilt, and they continue to do that. Where I, I choose not to. I choose not to. And I've had good support along the way, very good support. And when my spirit needed understanding, my true self here needed understanding, people were put in my path. And you got to remember that, like that's not just me. That goes for anybody. If you want to understand, it's going to get put in your path. And that's what today is about. This is what today is about, awareness. And when you're aware, you share, you know, you share because that's our truth. Like I am telling you today, my truth, right? There's a lot more to say, but I just want to put that out there for today. And yeah, take it, take the story and understand it. I haven't walked in their moccasins either or their shoes either, but nobody's walked in mine either. So, but this is my truth anyway. So yeah.
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 No, I appreciate all your words, Shirley, and certainly what you've done and what you share with us. I know it's not easy, and I think this is what many folks, once they start learning and this journey of learning Canada's history. I know it's not pretty, and
Mm-hmm.
but I think this is a conversation we have to have, and I think this is, how I framed this summer for a lot of folks. Is this is the T of the TRC. This is the truth, and we
Yeah.
have to hear that truth first before we can ever imagine what reconciliation could be. And we've got a long way to go. I mean, we're still truth telling, and so I really want to again acknowledge you and give you this gift, or again, we're living in this virtual world, so I would normally offer you some tobacco to for teaching for us. But unable to do that through Teams here. So so next time I see you, I'll have a little pouch of tobacco for you, and really
Yeah.
appreciate you giving your time on this day. So I want to give you the last words. If there's anything else that you'd like to share and offer in this for the students and staff and faculty at Laurier that may be watching this day, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you for that. Yeah. I just wanted to share where I work. I work in addictions, but where I work there, we don't treat the drugs and alcohol. We treat the trauma inside. And for us to move forward and help and encourage and support the person, the client to go move forward too, we have to do our own work. We have to. We don't go get our stuff out of a book or anything like that. We have to do our own work, and all this trauma and everything that comes up, we have to do it. Because you can only help somebody as far as you've gone. If you haven't gone, if you only gone halfway on your journey, you're only going to be able to help somebody halfway too. So just remember, your journey is forever. It's a lifelong journey, and that's what I'm on, is a lifelong journey. But I can also share and support and encourage. So please do that to yourself and use your voice. Use your voice and in a nice way, and good mind, gonna queel. And when you have that gonna queel, you attract that good stuff to you too. So you are what you attract. So be mindful, that mindfulness and everything too. So yeah, all the good stuff. Like Creator had this out here for us long time ago, right?
That's right.
All this medicine, this good medicine out there. The guy Diesel, he knew what we had to survive, to live life. And that's what I'm doing. I'm thriving because there's no way I want to be all pilled up or anything like that. So yeah. I'm using my medicines outside because they come right after my door.
All right,
Yeah.
Sherlene, thank you very much for spending the time with us, and I really wish you all the best.
Oh, yeah, we'll go.
All right, welcome back. We have Cody with us, Cody Groat, Assistant Professor in the Department of History and Indigenous Studies at Western University. He's previously served as a limited term instructor in Canadian and Indigenous history at Simon Fraser University, and he is presently a PhD candidate in the Department of History here at Laurier. He is a Mohawk and a band member of Six Nations of the Grand River. And his father, William, is a survivor of the 60s scoop, and his grandparents, Stanley and Sarah Grote, were survivors of the Mohawk Institute. So thanks, Cody, for joining us here on this September 30th, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So I know you've got some really unique stories to share about Indian residential schools and the experiences with your family, as well as your research. But I think one of the things that I've been hearing from so many folks, and we'll start here, but we'll go into some of the deeper stuff and your family's lived experience in a bit. But what do you think is most critical for Canadians to do on this inaugural day for truth and reconciliation?
I think it's just to take a step back and to listen to survivors and listen to their families. I always tell people in my life and who I meet in talks like this, if you learn something or if there's something you don't know about the residential school system, that's not a bad thing, because as you and I will touch on earlier, my grandparents were survivors of a residential school system, and I didn't know anything about this for the first 20 years of my own life because my family didn't talk about it. They were uncomfortable talking about it. So if this is something you're learning about even this year, even 5 or 6 years after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I don't think that's anything to be ashamed of. I think what's important is to recognize there's factors and there's reasons why you didn't know this before, to understand what those barriers might have been, and to listen to the survivors now that you have the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Cody, for that. I know that what I frequently hear from many folks is questioning when they start their learning journey, why didn't we hear about this before, and why don't we know about this? And but you have a unique perspective on that. So you did your undergraduate here at Laurier as well. So tell me about how you come to learn about your family's history.
So I grew up in Ingersoll, which is just about an hour from Brantford. Very Caucasian community, it's safe to say. And I always knew I was Indigenous. I had a status card. I went to the powwow on Six Nations a few times, but we weren't necessarily deeply ingrained in culture in my family for a variety of reasons. And I went to Laurier Brantford in 2012 to start my BA. And in my first semester of Laurier Brantford, I took a course called Indigenous Peoples in a Contemporary World, it was called at the time. It was taught by Kim Anderson, who was a professor at Laurier Brantford at the time and is now a dear friend. And in our first month at Laurier Brantford, she took us on a field trip to the Mohawk Institute residential school to learn about the residential school system. And admittedly, that was when I first learned about the residential school system itself and about the Mohawk Institute. But when we were walking through that building, in one of the first rooms, there's a big list on the wall of survivors of the Mohawk Institute and former students. And on that was Stanley Groat and Sarah Miracle, who I saw much later. And I honestly didn't even know that my grandfather's name was Stanley Groat. I just saw the last name. And I asked my dad about it that night, and he said, yes, that's my dad. My dad and my mom went there, but I don't know anything else about it. And for me, that was the beginning of understanding my family's residential school experience. So I was 20. My grandparents passed away in 1986 and 1988, before I was born. But my dad, who is now 70 years old, it only took him probably the past 2 or 3 years himself to understand what his parents' residential school experience meant, why he didn't know about it, and why it took him 70 years when his parents both went there, and his grandparents and his great-grandparents.
Yeah, that's incredible to learn that for the first time. That must have been a lot to process for you, all while you're trying to complete your first year at university.
It was confusing. I think that's the best way, because I'm learning about this and the atrocities that happened, and I see this man with the last name Grote, and it's not distant generations, it's my grandfather. And the fact that I didn't even necessarily know that was my grandfather's name. I didn't know this man was my grandfather, and I had to ask that and then learn the context. And there's so many layers associated with it. And that erasure, that closure, is also continued in part because of the 60 scoop, which my dad experienced, which for many is a continuation of the residential school system.
Certainly, and I think, for myself, being a professor in Indigenous studies and teaching that history, I encounter so many students who come to Laurier and don't have any idea what it is, or that the schools are fabricated into something of almost privilege, how boarding schools were
Right.
in Europe, and the story that this was, if you had money, you went to boarding school, right? That it was a good thing, that these schools were about education. And what we've learned, certainly through this summer, is there's significant harms that came from a lot of these schools. And I think the most challenging parts of that is trying to piece this together for conversations of reconciliation, knowing that this history has been so awful. And I think it's helped not only Indigenous families, but Canadians to realize, when we talk about the ongoing progression of trauma through the generations, whether we call it historic trauma or colonial trauma, intergenerational trauma, we're starting to see the full impact of harm that's happened. So as you've learned and discovered this, and then became an academic and a historian, how have you jumped into this and proceeded to learn more details?
Well, I think I'm going to tell a bit more about my dad's experience too, because I think that's really influenced me. And I know he's comfortable with me telling this because he's done some public speaking about his 60 scoop experience. But when he was growing up with his biological family before he was adopted, his parents were alcoholics, and in many ways they were violent. And now that he's 70 years old, he's learning about the residential school system. And then his father was in World War II, and his father was in the Korean War. And he's told me a few times he can't forgive some of the treatment of his parents, but he can understand now why they might have been damaged. He refers to them as damaged people. And he said that for the longest time, he just didn't know that or know why. And he thought it was his fault in some cases. And I think that's really interesting to understand. My dad is now 35 years sober, but he was also an alcoholic for a period of time. And again, he starts looking at these experiences, and now that we're older, he looks at how he raised us. And he never drank in my lifetime, and he tried very hard and consciously because of what he remembered of his own parents and lived experience. But now, as a historian, I'm looking at the residential school system, and there's other colleagues in the history department at my own institution who might have been studying this for a longer period of time. I'm still new to this. I'm a young historian. But to look at these systems and to see how it impacted my family and my lived experience. And again, how I didn't know any of this for so long until I was the age of my own students now in undergraduate classes. And again, I don't want them to think that that is their own fault, because even in my own family, it was hidden and it was kept quiet. And it was because of all this trauma that continued, and it's impacted the narrative. And now when people are even learning about these mass unmarked graves, a lot of community members have known about this for so long. And it's again part of this process where community members know about this, but they either can't talk about it, or when they are talking about it, they're not being heard by the public. So I think days like today, we're being heard, which is great.
Yeah, I think that, so outside the university, I've done a lot of work in the public sector and working with different levels of government, and the TRC report came out in 2015, and the 94 calls to action. And that in itself, it's a good plan. It's a good start, but always, if we look throughout history, we've had these markers in Canada where promises of different governments, different levels of government trying to do better. And I never argue against the fact that the government has tried in investing huge sums of money in trying to fix the situation. When you look at the public health data and how poor the quality of life and standards of living for many Indigenous families continue to be. But there's so much effort that we have to unpack in this history to really understand it. And it is certainly tied to Indian residential school, but we know also there are so many other pieces to it. And the reference you're making to the 60 scoop, many people watching today may not even know what that element is, that there was a period of time in Canada when they start closing the schools down and start forcibly putting child welfare authorities into First Nations reserves and forcing children into protective custody and right into adoption. And they weren't placed into foster homes, but they were adopted out. And on social media from time to time, you can still see circulars where you could buy an Indian child for $10, right? And our people went all over the world, right? So when we're starting to unpack this stuff and looking at how do we actually start turning towards reconciliation, I think this is where so much of, as you mentioned, that truth telling. And I think what's really triggered this for all people is those discoveries of the graves. Because I think that for many in Canada, as you said, Indigenous families have known, survivors of these schools have known, but for many Canadians who maybe haven't listened enough, that this has been a significant marker for them to realize that we cannot hide from this colonial history and harm any longer. So I know in your work in history, how do you kind of piece this together around these historic sites and the commemoration of these historic sites? I know that's your research interest, but share a little bit about that and what your thoughts are on these schools and what we should be doing beyond this day in recognition.
So my research looks at the work of a body called the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. And it was established in 1919 as a federal advisory body to help the federal government determine what should be commemorated as a National Historic Site of Canada. And throughout the past 100 years, Indigenous sites, sacred sites, village sites have been discussed in various ways, and very often Indigenous perspectives have been ignored, which we can expect in many ways from a government body working for 100 years. But just recently now, we're starting to see the commemoration of residential schools as National Historic Sites. As of this week, there's been 4 residential schools across Canada that have been designated as National Historic Sites: Shingwauk, Shubenacadie, Portage la Prairie, and Musqueam. And what's fascinating to me is the way that we commemorate and determine the national significance of something is often based on built heritage. This building is this many years old, or it's representative of this architectural style. And a lot of residential school survivors who are submitting these sites for commemoration don't care about those built features of the school. To them, what's important is the intangible values or the feelings associated with these sites. And they're not even wanting to commemorate the abuses that took place or the cultural assimilation that took place, the forced separation from their families. They're looking at these buildings and they're saying that their national significance is what's happened from about 2015 to present, reclaiming these sites as sites of cultural revitalization, reclaiming these sites as Indigenous nations and going to them as a place to remember our ancestors who were lost or who were forced to go there, or for sharing these stories amongst our communities about what happened. And that's how they're saying these schools are nationally significant. And I think, again, that's part of this shift, and that's us being able to define the narrative ourselves. Because for so long, even after it was recognized from the 1980s and 1990s that these were systematically abusive places, it was still this narrative in public about the victimization of Indigenous peoples. And I think it is important to recognize those systematic abuses, but also now we are looking at what happened and we are reclaiming our cultures, reclaiming our languages, and we're combating what happened to us in these institutions.
I know locally with the Mohawk Institute in Brantford. So I remember when the school, not when the school closed down, but later on through the years, there's been a lot of discussion about, should we keep the building standing? Should we tear it down? Should we burn it down? That building itself, I think that's the third building, because it was burned down through the years, as many schools were across the country, because people knew what was happening there, and they just imagined that if we burned it down, then it would be done with and we wouldn't have to go to school there anymore. But they just rebuilt them, right? And so I know that discussion before we started the Save the Evidence campaign at the Woodlands Cultural Center now, that was a real deliberation. Should we invest millions of dollars to try to restore this building, or should we tear it down and just do away with it? And there were a lot of mixed feelings, I can remember. But for a lot of survivors, it was exactly that. They wanted people to know this history. And the fear is, if we just tore it down and destroyed the building, then we wouldn't have to teach any of this stuff. And then all of their lived experiences would be forgotten. And so I think the Save the Evidence campaign has been a remarkable strategy to have it restored back to what it looked like as a residential school. Because for many folks, we don't realize that when they closed that site down, they turned it into leaseholding and they chopped it all up and turned it into offices and things like that. But now they're in their final phase of restoration, and they're going to be doing walking tours through there again, and you'll be able to actually see what it looked like as a residential school once again.
And I think it's a fair question or fair idea for me to say, if that was torn down, I wonder if my family would have known that we went there, would have looked into that. It would have been, we probably would have done some digging after the TRC came out. But again, if I didn't see my grandfather's name on that wall, where would our family story be? And I've done some digging, and I found I received my grandmother's residential school file from the National Center for TRC, and it's only 4 documents. She got a tooth extracted while she was there, and one is just a basic information card that has the number she was referred to. And that's about the extent of our knowledge. And it's painful, but again, I wonder, in my family's context, what would we have known? What would we have lost in that story? So it's hard.
Absolutely. And the truth telling that, we're having to do from the Indigenous perspective, and piecing our family's histories together and our stories together. So for me, I know I'm extremely privileged, because I'm 4 generations removed from Indian residential school. So I certainly didn't grow up with the trauma that many families have. But my ancestry, it was my grandparents, who went to Carlisle in the United States, because that's where my grandmother was from.
Wow.
Ohio in New York State, and so her grandparents had went to Carlisle. So I want to leave you the last words, Cody, and any of this conversation, anything else that you'd like to share. And again, really appreciate you coming to join us today and share. But any final thoughts, last words you'd like to share on this day?
I think just reiterating one of the points I said at the very beginning, if you're learning new things today that you didn't know before, that's not something to be bad about, to feel bad about, but also don't make this day the only day you learn about this. You can learn about this all year round by listening to survivors, by listening to Indigenous nations. And I think this is a great opportunity to do so. So thank you for having me.
Thanks. I can't say anything better than that, Cody, and I really appreciate that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bojo Gichimanado, Anjabanisukwe Indishnakas, Makwa and Dodam, Bawating and Donjaba, Anishinaabe Kwe and Dow. Miigwech for the spirit that is within all of life and at the center of life. I have felt the spirit present in this work that we are called to do. I am grateful for our ancestors standing with us, that their thoughts were with us in the way that our thoughts need to be with our youth, with those on their way here for generations to come. I lift up my gratitude to give thanks and ask for this work to continue, that we tend the fire of truth and reconciliation together relentlessly. Miigwech again for this day and for this opportunity to come together. Nakanagana.